Hello, welcome to Goodnight Flagstaff. I'm Claire Obermarck. I reside here in northern Arizona. I'm a traditional storyteller, and that means that I retell traditional stories from memory that have been told orally to me. But of course, I love reading stories as well. So thanks for tuning in tonight to our community story time. You can find a new chapter from one of our favourite family-friendly books at 8 p.m. each weeknight on the Literary Centre's YouTube channel and on Crater Radio, a great local online radio station. The previous chapter is replayed on Crater Radio each weeknight at about 7:30, just before the new chapter airs. You can also listen to all previous Goodnight Flagstaff recordings on YouTube. We're currently reading The Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkein. If you'd like to check it out to read along with us at home, it is available at the library, so check one out today with your Coconino County Library card. Please email us if you'd like to join our team of readers and connect with your community through stories. All ages welcome. Our email is goodnightflagstaff@gmail.com. Last time we read together, the hobbits discussed the events that had happened and whatever the decisions of the council might be. Eventually it was decided that 9 would go on the quest to destroy the ring, but not until the rangers returned from the various fact-gathering journeys, and by then it was approaching winter, but couldn't be helped. As Aragorn had gone to have the sword of Elendil forged anew, Bilbo also sent Frodo with a small sword called Sting, plus other items he had been saving, and so they began their journey. They had been a fortnight on the way when the weather changed. The wind suddenly fell and then veered round to the south. The swift flowing clouds lifted and melted away, and the sun came out, pale and bright. There came a cold, clear dawn at the end of a long, stumbling night march. The travellers reached a low ridge crowned with ancient holly trees, whose grey-green trunks seemed to have been built out of the very stone of the hills. Their dark leaves shone and their berries glowed red in the light of the rising sun. Away in the south, Frodo could see the dim shapes of lofty mountains that seemed now to stand across the path that the company was taking. At the left of this high range rose 3 peaks. The tallest and nearest stood up like a tooth, tipped with snow. Its great bare northern precipice was still largely in the shadow, but where the sunlight slanted upon it, it glowed red. Gandalf stood at Frodo's side and looked out under his hand. We have done well," he said. "We have reached the borders of the country that men call Hollin. Many elves lived here in happier days. When Eregion was its name, 45 leagues as the crow flies we have come. Though many long miles further our feet have walked, the land and the weather will be milder now, but perhaps more dangerous." "Dangerous or not, a real sunrise is mighty welcome," said Frodo, throwing back his hood and letting the mountain light fall on his face. "But the mountains are ahead of us," said Pippin. "We must have turned eastward in the night." "No," said Gandalf, "but you see further ahead in the clear light. Behind those peaks the range bends round southwest. There are many maps in Elrond's house, but I suppose you never thought to look at them." "Oh, yes, I did sometimes," said Pippin, "but I don't remember them. Frodo had a better head for that sort of thing." "I need no map," said Gimli, who had come up with Legolas and was gazing out before him with a strange light in his deep eyes. "There is the land where our fathers worked of old, and we have wrought the image of those mountains into many works of metal and of stone, and into many songs and tales. They stand tall in our dreams, Baraz, Zirak, Shathua. Only once before have I seen them from afar in waking life, but I know them and their names, for under them lies Khazak Dûn, the Dwaro Delph, that is now called the Black Pit, Moria in the Elvish tongue. Yonder stands Barazimbar, the Red Horn, cruel Carathras, and beyond him a Silvertine and Cloudy Head, Calibdil the White, and Fanwithrol the Grey, that we call Zaraxigil, and Bundishathur. There are misty mountains divide, and between their arms lies the deep-shadowed valley that which we cannot forget, as Anulbizar, the Dimril Dale, which the elves call Nanduthrion." "It is for the Dimril Dale that we are making," said Gandalf. "If we climb the pass that is called the Red Horn Gate, under the far side of Carathras, we shall come down by the Dimril Stair into the deep vale of the dwarves. There lies the Mirrormere, and there the river Silverlode rises in its icy springs. Dark is the water, of Khaled-Zeram, said Gimli, and cold are the springs of Kibble-Nala. My heart trembles at the thought that I may see them soon. May you have joy of the sight, my good dwarf, said Gandalf, but whatever you may do, we at least cannot stay in that valley. We must go down the Silver Lode into the secret woods, and so to the great river, and then... He paused. Yes, and where then? Asked Merry. To the end of the journey. In the end, said Gandalf. We cannot look too far ahead. Let us be glad that the first stage is safely over. I think we will rest here, not only today but tonight as well. There is a wholesome air about Hollin. Much evil must befall a country before it wholly forgets the elves if once they dwelt here. That is true, said Legolas. But the elves of this land were of a race strange to us of the Sylvan folk, and the trees and the grass do not now remember them. Only I hear the stones lament them. Deep they delved us, fair they wrought us, high they builded us, but they are gone, they are gone. They sought the havens long ago. That morning they lit a fire in a deep hollow shrouded by great bushes of holly, and their supper breakfast was merrier than it had been since they set out. They did not hurry to bed afterwards, for they expected to have all the night to sleep in, and they did not mean to go on again until the evening of the next day. Only Aragorn was silent and restless. After a while he left the company and wandered on to the ridge, where he stood in the shadow of a tree, looking out southwards and westwards, with his head posed as if he was listening. Then he returned to the brink of the dell and looked down at the others laughing and talking. "What is the matter, Strider?" Merry called up. "What are you looking for? Do you miss the east wind?" "No, indeed," he answered, "but I miss something. I have been in the country of Hollin in many seasons. No folk dwell here now, but many other creatures live here at all times, especially birds. Yet now all things but you are silent. I can feel it. There is no sound for miles about us, and your voices seem to make the ground echo. I do not understand it." Gandalf looked up with sudden interest. "But what do you guess is the reason?" he asked. "Is there more in it than surprise at seeing 4 hobbits, not to mention the rest of us, where people are so seldom seen or heard?" "I hope that is it," answered Aragorn. "But I have a sense of watchfulness and of fear that I have never had here before." "Then we must be more careful," said Gandalf. "If you bring a ranger with you, it is well to pay attention to him, especially if the ranger is Aragorn. We must stop talking aloud, rest quietly, and set the watch." It was Sam's turn that day to take the first watch, but Aragorn joined him. The others fell asleep. Then the silence grew until even Sam felt it. The breathing of the sleepers could be plainly heard. The swish of the pony's tail and the occasional movements of his feet became loud noises. Sam could hear his own joints creaking if he stirred. Dead silence was around him, and over all hung a clear blue sky. As the sun rode up from the east, away in the south a dark patch appeared and grew and drove north like flying smoke in the wind. "What's that, Strider? It don't look like cloud," said Sam in a whisper to Aragorn. He made no answer. He was gazing intently at the sky, but before long Sam could see for himself what was approaching. Flocks of birds, flying at great speed, were wheeling and circling and traversing all the land as if they were searching for something, and they were steadily drawing nearer. "Lie flat and still," hissed Aragorn, pulling Sam down into the shade of a holly bush, for a whole regiment of birds had broken away suddenly from the main host and came flying low, straight across the ridge. Sam thought they were a kind of crow of large size, as they passed overhead in so dense a throng that their shadow followed them darkly over the ground below. One harsh croak was heard. Not until they had dwindled into the distance north and west, and the sky was again clear, would Aragorn rise. Then he sprang up and went and wakened Gandalf. "Regiments of black crows are flying over all the land between the mountains and the Grey Flood," he said, "and they have passed over Hollin. They are not natives here. There are Crebain out of Fanghorn and Dunland. I do not know what they are about. Possibly there is some trouble away south from which they are fleeing, but I think they are spying out the land. I have also glimpsed many hawks flying up in the sky. I think we ought to move again this evening. Hollin is no longer wholesome for us. It is being watched." "And in that case, so is the Redhorn Gate," said Gandalf. And how we can get over that without being seen, I cannot imagine, but we will think of that when we must. As for moving as soon as it is dark, I'm afraid that you are right." "Luckily, our fire made little smoke, and had burned low before the Crebain came," said Aragorn. "It must be put out, and not lit again." "Well, if that isn't a plague and a nuisance," said Pippin. The news no fire and a move again by night had been broken to him as soon as he woke in the late afternoon. "All because of a pack of crows. I had looked forward to a real good meal tonight, something hot." "Well, you can go on looking forward," said Gandalf. "There may be many unexpected feasts ahead for you. For myself, I should like a pipe to smoke in comfort and warm my feet. However, we are certain of one thing at any rate. It will get warmer as we get south." "Too warm, I shouldn't wonder," muttered Sam to Frodo. "But I'm beginning to think it's time we got a sight of that fiery mountain and saw the end of the road, so to speak. I thought at first that this here Redhorn, or whatever his name is, might be it, till Gimli spoke his piece. A fair jaw-cracker dwarf language must be." Maps conveyed nothing to Sam's mind, and all distances in these strange lands seemed so vast that he was quite out of his reckoning. All that day the company remained in hiding. The dark birds passed over now and again, but as the westering sun grew red they disappeared southwards. At dusk the company set out, and turning now half east they steered their course towards Carithras, which far away still glowed faintly red in the last light of the vanished sun. One by one white stars sprang forth as the sky faded. Guided by Aragorn they struck a good path. It looked to Frodo like the remains of an ancient road that had once been broad and well planned. From Hollin to the mountain pass. The moon, now at the full, rose over the mountains and cast a pale light in which the shadows of stones were black. Many of them looked to have been worked by hands, though now they lay tumbled and ruinous in a bleak barren land. It was the cold, chill hour before the first stir of dawn, and the moon was low. Frodo looked up at the sky. Suddenly he saw, or felt, a shadow pass over the high stars. As if for a moment they faded and then flashed out again. He shivered. "Did you see anything pass over?" he whispered to Gandalf, who was just ahead. "No, but I felt it, whatever it was," he answered. "It may be nothing, only a wisp of thin cloud." "It was moving fast then," muttered Aragorn, "and not with the wind." Nothing further happened that night. The next morning dawned even brighter than before, but the air was chill again. Already the wind was turning back towards the east. For 2 more nights they marched on, climbing steadily but ever more slowly as their road wound up into the hills, and the mountains towered up nearer and nearer. On the 3rd morning, Carithras rose before them, a mighty peak, tipped with snow like silver, but with sheer naked sides dull red, as if stained with blood. There was a black look in the sky, and the sun was wan. The wind had gone now round to the northeast. Gandalf snuffed the air and looked back. "Winter deepens behind us," he said quietly to Aragorn. "The heights away north are whiter than they were. Snow is lying far down the shoulders. Tonight we shall be on our way high up towards the Redhorn Gate. We may well be seen by watchers on that narrow path and waylaid by some evil, but the weather may prove a more deadly enemy than any. What do you think of your course now, Aragorn?" Frodo overheard these words and understood that Gandalf and Aragorn were continuing some debate that had begun long before. He listened anxiously. "I think no good of our course from beginning to end, as you well know, Gandalf," answered Aragorn, "and perils known and unknown will grow as we go on. But we must go on, and it is no good our delaying the passage of the mountains. Further south there are no passes till one comes to the Gap of Rohan. I do not trust that way since your news of Saruman. Who knows which side now the marshals of the Horse Lord serve?" "Who knows indeed," said Gandalf. "But there is another way, and not by the pass of Carithras, the dark and secret way that we have spoken of." "But let us not speak of it again. Not yet. Say nothing to the others, I beg. Not until it is plain that there is no other way." "We must decide before we go further," answered Gandalf. Then let us weigh the matter in our minds, while the others rest and sleep, said Aragorn. In the late afternoon, while the others were finishing their breakfast, Gandalf and Aragorn went aside together and stood looking at Caerthras. Its sides were now dark and sullen, and its head was in grey cloud. Frodo watched them, wondering which way the debate would go. When they returned to the company, Gandalf spoke, and then he knew that it had been decided to face the weather and the high pass. He was relieved. He could not guess what was the other dark and secret way, but the very mention of it had seemed to fill Aragorn with dismay, and Frodo was glad that it had been abandoned. "From signs that we have seen lately," said Gandalf, "I fear that the Red Horn Gate may be watched, and also I have doubts of the weather that is coming up behind. Snow may come. We must go with all the speed that we can. Even so, it will take us more than 2 marches before we reach the top of the pass. Dark will come early this evening. We must leave as soon as you can get ready." "I will add a word of advice, if I may," said Boromir. "I was born under the shadow of the White Mountains, and know something of journeys in the high places. We shall meet bitter cold, if no worse, before we come down on the other side. It will not help us to keep so secret that we are frozen to death. When we leave here, where there are still a few trees and bushes, each of us should carry a faggot of wood as large as he can bear." "And Bill could take a bit more, couldn't you, lad?" said Sam. The pony looked at him mournfully. "Very well," said Gandalf, "but we must not use the wood, not unless it is a choice between fire and death." The company set out again, with good speed at first, but soon their way became steep and difficult. The twisting and climbing road had in many places almost disappeared, and was blocked with many fallen stones. The night grew deadly dark under great clouds. A bitter wind swirled among the rocks. By midnight they had climbed to the knees of the great mountains. The narrow path now wound under a sheer wall of cliffs to the left, above which the grim flanks of Caerthras towered up invisible in the gloom. On the right was a gulf of darkness, where the land fell suddenly into a deep ravine. Laboriously they climbed a sharp slope and halted for a moment at the top. Frodo felt a soft touch on his face. He put out his arm and saw the dim white flakes of snow settling on his sleeve. They went on, but before long the snow was falling fast, filling all the air and swirling into Frodo's eyes. The dark bent shapes of Gandalf and Aragorn, only a pace or 2 ahead, could hardly be seen. "I don't like this at all," panted Sam just behind. "Snow's all right on a fine morning, but I like to be in bed whilst it's falling. I wish this lot would go off to Hobbiton. Folk might welcome it there." Except on the high moors of the North Farthing, a heavy fall was rare in the Shire, and was regarded as a pleasant event and a chance for fun. No living hobbit, save Bilbo, could remember the fell winter of 1311, when white wolves invaded the Shire over the frozen Brandywine. Gandalf halted. Snow was thick on his hood and shoulders. It was already ankle-deep about his boots. "This is what I feared," he said. "What do you say now, Aragorn?" "That I feared it too," Aragorn answered, "but less than other things. I knew the risk of snow, though it seldom falls heavily so far south, save high up in the mountains, but we are not high yet. We are still far down, where the paths are usually open all the winter." "I wonder if this is a contrivance of the enemy," said Boromir. "They say in my land that he can govern the storms of the mountains of shadow that stand upon the borders of Mordor. He has strange powers and many allies." "His arm has grown long indeed," said Gimli, "if he can draw snow down from the north to trouble his ear 300 leagues away." "His arm has grown long," said Gandalf. While they were halted, the wind died down, and the snow slackened until it almost ceased. They tramped on again, but they had not gone more than a furlong when the storm returned with a fresh fury. The wind whistled, and the snow became a blinding blizzard. Soon even Boromir found it hard to keep going. The hobbits, bent nearly double, toiled along behind the taller folk, but it was plain they could not go much further if the snow continued. Frodo's feet felt like lead. Pippin was dragging behind. Even Gimli, as stout as any dwarf could be, was grumbling as he trudged. The company halted suddenly, as if they had come to an agreement without any words being spoken. They heard eerie noises in the darkness around them. It may have been only a trick of the wind in the cracks and gullies of the rocky wall, but the sounds were those of shrill cries and wild howls of laughter. Stones began to fall from the mountainside, whistling over their heads or crashing on the path beside them. Every now and again they heard a dull rumble as a great boulder rolled down from hidden heights above. "We cannot go further tonight," said Boromir. "Let those call it the wind who will. There are foul voices on the air, and these stones are aimed at us." "I do call it the wind," said Aragorn, "but that does not make what you say untrue. There are many evil and unfriendly things in the world that have little love for those that go on two legs, and yet are not in league with Sauron, but have purposes of their own. Some have been in this world longer than he." "Carathras was called the Cruel, and had an ill name," said Gimli, "long years ago, when rumour of Sauron had not been heard in these lands." "It matters little who is the enemy if we cannot beat off his attack," said Gandalf. "But what can we do?" cried Pippin miserably. He was leaning on Merry and Frodo, and he was shivering. "Either stop where we are, or go back," said Gandalf. "It is no good going on, only a little higher. If I remember rightly, this path leaves the cliff and runs into a wide, shallow trough at the bottom of a long, hard slope. We should have no shelter there from snow or stones or anything else." "And it is no good going back while the storm holds," said Aragorn. "We have passed no place on the way up that offered more shelter than this cliff wall we are under now." "Shelter," muttered Sam. "If this is shelter, then one wall and no roof makes an house." The company now gathered together as close to the cliff as they could. It faced southwards, and near the bottom it leaned out a little, so that they hoped it would give them some protection from the northerly wind and from the falling stones. But eddying blasts swirled around them from every side, and the snow flowed down in even denser clouds. They huddled together with their backs to the wall. Bill the pony stood patiently but dejectedly in front of the hobbits, and screened them a little. But before long the drifting snow was above his hocks, and it went on mounting. If they had no larger companions, the hobbits would soon have been entirely buried. A great sleepiness came over Frodo. He felt himself sinking fast into a warm and hazy dream. He thought a fire was heating his toes, and out of the shadows on the other side of the hearth he heard Bilbo's voice speaking. "I don't think much of your diary," he said. "So storms on January the 12th. There was no need to come back to report that." "But I wanted rest and sleep, Bilbo," Frodo answered with an effort. When he felt himself being shaken, and he came back painfully to wakefulness, Boromir had lifted him off the ground out of a nest of snow. "This will be the death of the halflings, Gandalf," said Boromir. "It is useless to sit here until the snow goes over our heads. We must do something to save ourselves." "Give them this," said Gandalf, searching in his pack and drawing out a leathern flask. "Just a mouthful each for all of us. It is very precious. It is Myrovur, the cordial of Imladris. Elrond gave it to me at our parting. Pass it round." As soon as Frodo had swallowed a little of the warm and fragrant liquor, he felt a new strength of heart, and the heavy drowsiness left his limbs. The others also revived and found fresh hope and vigour, but the snow did not relent. It whirled about them thicker than ever, and the wind blew louder. "What do you say to fire?" asked Boromir suddenly. "The choice seems near now between fire and death, Gandalf. Doubtless we shall be hidden from all unfriendly eyes when the snow has covered us, but that will not help us." "You may make a fire if you can," answered Gandalf. "If there are any watchers that can endure this storm, then they can see us, fire or no." But though they had bought wood and kindlings by the advice of Boromir, it passed the skill of elf or even dwarf to strike a flame that would hold amid the swirling wind or catch in the wet fuel. At last, reluctantly, Gandalf himself took a hand. Picking up a faggot, he held it aloft for a moment, and then with a word of command, "Nor and Dreth Amen!" he thrust the end of his staff into the midst of it. At once a great spout of green and blue flame sprang out, and the wood flared and spluttered. "If there are any to see, then I at least am revealed to them," he said. "I have written Gandalf in here, in signs that all can read from Rivendell to the mouths of Anduin." But the company cared no longer for watchers or unfriendly eyes. Their hearts were rejoiced to see the light of the fire. The wood burned merrily, and though all round it the snow hissed, and pools of slush crept under their feet, they warmed their hands gladly at the blaze. There they stood, stooping in a circle round the little dancing and blowing flames. A red light was on their tired and anxious faces. Behind them the night was like a black wall, but the wood was burning fast, and the snow still fell. The fire burned low, and the last faggot was thrown on. "The night is getting old," said Aragorn. "The dawn is not far off." "If any dawn can pierce these clouds," said Gimli. Boromir stepped out of the circle and stared up into the blackness. "The snow is growing less," he said, "and the wind is quieter." Frodo gazed warily at the flakes still falling out of the dark to be revealed white for a moment in the light of the dying fire, but for a long time he could see no sign of their slackening. Then suddenly a sleep was beginning to creep over him again. He was aware that the wind had indeed fallen, and the flakes were becoming larger and fewer. Very slowly a dim light began to grow. At last the snow stopped altogether. As the light grew stronger, it showed a silent, shrouded world. Below the refuge were white humps and domes and shapeless deeps, beneath which the path that they had trodden was altogether lost. But the heights above were hidden in great clouds, still heavy with the threat of snow. Gimli looked up and shook his head. "Caradhras has not forgiven us," he said. "He has more snow yet to fling at us if we go on. The sooner we go back and down, the better." To this all agreed, but their retreat was now difficult. It might well prove impossible. Only a few paces from the ashes of their fire the snow lay many feet deep, higher than the heads of the hobbits. In places it had been scooped and piled by the wind into great drifts against the cliff. "If Gandalf would go before us with a bright flame, he might melt a path for you," said Legolas. The storm had troubled him little, and he alone of the company remained still light of heart. "If elves could ever fly over mountains, they might fetch the sun to save us," answered Gandalf. "But I must have something to work on. I cannot burn snow." "Well," said Boromir, "when heads are at a loss, bodies must serve, as we say in my country. The strongest of us must seek a way. See, through all is now snow-clad. Our path, as we came up, turned about that shoulder of rock down yonder. It was there that the snow first began to burden us. If we could reach that point, maybe it would prove easier beyond. It is no more than a furlong off, I guess." "Then let us force a path thither, you and I," said Aragorn. Aragorn was the tallest of the company, but Boromir, little less in height, was broader and heavier in build. He led the way, and Aragorn followed him. Slowly they moved off, and were soon toiling heavily. In places the snow was breast high, and often Boromir seemed to be swimming or burrowing with his great arms rather than walking. Legolas watched them for a while with a smile upon his lips, and then he turned to the others. "The strongest must seek a way, say you? But I say, let a ploughman plough, but choose an otter for swimming, and for running light over grass and leaf, and over snow, an elf." With that he sprang forth nimbly, and then Frodo noticed, as if for the first time, though he had long known it, that the elf had no boots, but wore only light shoes, as he always did, and his feet made little imprint in the snow. "Farewell," he said to Gandalf. "I go to find the sun." Then swift as a runner over firm sand he shot away, and quickly overtaking the toiling men with a wave of his hand as he passed them, and sped into the distance, and vanished round the rocky turn. The others waited huddled together, watching until Boromir and Aragorn dwindled into black specks in the whiteness. At length they too passed from sight. The time dragged on, the clouds lowered, and now a few flakes of snow came curling down again. An hour maybe went by, though it seemed far longer, and then at last they saw Legolas coming back. At the same time Boromir and Aragorn reappeared round the bend far behind him, and came labouring up the slope. "Well," cried Legolas as he ran up, "I have not brought the sun. She is walking in the blue fields of the south, and a little wreath of snow on this red-horn hillock troubles her not at all. But I have brought back a gleam of good hope for those who are doomed to go on their feet. There is the greatest wind-drift of all just beyond the turn, and there our strong men were almost buried, They despaired until I returned and told them that the drift was little wider than a wall, and on the other side the snow suddenly grows less, while further down it is no more than a white coverlet to cool a hobbit's toes. Ah, it is as I said, growled Gimli. It was no ordinary storm. It is the ill will of Carithras. It does not love elves and dwarfs, and that drift was laid to cut off our escape. But happily your Carithras has forgotten that you have men with you, said Boromir, who came up at that moment, and doughty men too, if I may say it, though lesser men with spades might have served you better. Still, we have thrust a lane through the drift, and for all that all here may be grateful, who cannot run as light as elves. But how are we to get down there, even if you have cut through the drift? Said Pippin, voicing the thought of all the hobbits. Have hope, said Boromir. I am weary, but I still have some strength left, and Aragorn too. We will bear the little folk. The others no doubt will make shift to tread the path behind us. Come, Master Peregrine, I will begin with you. He lifted up the hobbit. Cling to my back, I shall need my arms, he said, and strode forward. Aragorn with Merry came behind. Pippin marvelled at his strength, seeing the passage that he had already forced, with no other tool than his great limbs. Even now, burdened as he was widening the track for those who followed, thrusting the snow aside as he went. They came at length to the great drift. It was flung across the mountain path like a sheer and sudden wall, and its crest, sharp as if shaped with knives, reared up more than twice the height of Boromir. But through the middle a passage had been beaten, rising and falling like a bridge. On the far side Merry and Pippin were set down, and there they waited with Legolas for the rest of the company to arrive. After a while Boromir returned carrying Sam. Behind in the narrow but now well-trodden track came Gandalf, leading Bill with Gimli perched among the baggage. Last came Aragorn carrying Frodo. They passed through the lane, but hardly had Frodo touched the ground than with a deep rumble there rolled down a fall of stones and slithering snow. The spray of it half blinded the company as they crouched against the cliff, and when the air cleared again they saw that the path was blocked behind them. Enough! Enough! Cried Gimli. We are departing as quickly as we may. And indeed with that last stroke the malice of the mountains seemed to be expanded, as if Carithras was satisfied that the invaders had been beaten off and would not dare to return. The threat of snow lifted, the clouds began to break, and the light grew broader. As Legolas had reported, they found that the snow became steadily more shallow as they went down, so that even the hobbits could trudge along. Soon they all stood once more on the flat shelf at the head of the steep slope where they had felt the first flakes of snow the night before. The morning was now far advanced. From the high place they looked back westwards over the lower lands. Far away in the tumble of country that lay at the foot of the mountain was the dell from which they had started to climb the pass. Frodo's legs ached. He was chilled to the bone and hungry, and his head was dizzy as he thought of the long and painful march downhill. Black specks swam before his eyes. He rubbed them, but the black specks remained, in the distance below him, but still high above the lower foothills. Dark dots were circling in the air. The birds again, said Aragorn, pointing down. That cannot be helped now, said Gandalf. Whether they are good or evil, or have nothing to do with us at all, we must go down at once. Not even on the knees of Carithras will we wait for another nightfall. A cold wind flowed down behind them as they turned their backs on the Red Horn Gate and stumbled warily down the slope. Carithras had defeated them. Well, thank you for tuning in. Join us next time for the first part of Chapter 4 in Book 2 of the Fellowship of the Ring. Good night, Flagstaff.